The AH-64E Apache Guardian is not just another helicopter deployment. When 72 of the most lethal attack helicopters in the American arsenal suddenly appear within striking distance of Iran's border, positioned specifically at forward operating bases in Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, that is not routine rotation. That is not exercises. That is the United States military pre-positioning assets for a conflict scenario that Tehran hoped would never materialize. By the time we are done, you will understand exactly why this deployment represents the most significant escalation in the Persian Gulf since Operation Desert Storm, and why Iran's entire defensive doctrine just became obsolete overnight. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications because what I'm about to show you is not speculation, it is not theory, this is happening right now, and the implications stretch far beyond the Middle East. This is about how modern warfare actually works when a superpower decides to send an unmistakable message. I am going to show you exactly what 72 Apache helicopters can do that no other weapon system in the American arsenal can replicate. We will cover the specific technical capabilities that make the AH-64E the perfect instrument for the Iranian threat environment, the strategic doctrine that turned attack helicopters from Cold War relics into precision strike platforms, and the geographic reality that puts every Iranian military installation within 200 miles of the Gulf Coast at immediate risk. By the end, you will understand why this deployment is not about deterrence anymore. This is about having the right tool positioned for the right job at the exact right moment, and what that means for Tehran's calculations going forward. Let me give you the strategic background that makes this deployment genuinely significant. The Persian Gulf has been a flashpoint for American military presence since the 1980s, but the nature of that presence has evolved dramatically. For decades, American power projection in the region relied primarily on naval assets, carrier strike groups, and long-range bombers operating from regional bases or even as far away as Diego Garcia. The logic was simple: maintain standoff distance, minimize ground presence, rely on technological superiority to strike from beyond the reach of Iranian retaliation. That doctrine worked reasonably well when Iran's primary threats were aging fighter jets and crude ballistic missiles. But Tehran did not sit idle. Over the past 15 years, Iran has systematically built a defensive network specifically designed to counter American standoff capabilities. Hardened underground bunkers protect critical command nodes and weapons production facilities. Advanced air defense systems purchased from Russia, including the S-300 and more recently components of the S-400, create overlapping coverage that makes high-altitude strikes increasingly risky. Shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles threaten carrier groups that venture too close to Iranian territorial waters. And most critically, Iran has dispersed its military-industrial complex across dozens of facilities, many buried deep underground or hidden in mountainous terrain that makes them extraordinarily difficult to hit with standoff weapons. This is where the Apache deployment changes everything. Attack helicopters operate in an entirely different battle space than fighter jets or cruise missiles. They fly low, hugging terrain, exploiting valleys and ridgelines to approach targets from unexpected angles. Their operating altitude, typically between 50 and 500 feet above ground level, puts them below most conventional air defense radar coverage designed to detect high-flying aircraft. They carry precision-guided munitions specifically designed for hardened targets, but they deliver those munitions from ranges and angles that underground facilities were never designed to defend against. And perhaps most importantly, they can loiter over target areas, providing sustained fire support and battlefield awareness that hit-and-run strike packages cannot replicate. Now let me tell you about the AH-64E Apache Guardian itself, because this is not your father's helicopter from Vietnam or the Gulf War. The E model represents a fundamental transformation in what attack helicopters can do. It entered service in 2011, and every single capability was designed around the lessons learned from 2 decades of counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, combined with contingency planning for high-intensity conflict against near-peer adversaries. The AH-64E carries a maximum weapon load of 17,000 pounds. Think about what that means. A single Apache can carry 16 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, each one a precision-guided anti-tank or anti-structure weapon with a range of 8 kilometers. It also mounts a M230 chain gun firing 30mm high-explosive dual-purpose rounds at 625 rounds per minute, effective against light armor, personnel, and unarmored structures up to a range of 4,000 meters. But here is what makes the E model genuinely revolutionary: the addition of the longbow fire control radar and the integration with Link 16 tactical data networks. That longbow radar allows the Apache to detect, classify, and prioritize targets while remaining masked behind terrain. The helicopter can hover behind a ridgeline, just the radar dome exposed above the terrain, and identify every vehicle and structure within a 10-kilometer radius. Then it can pop up, fire, and disappear back behind cover in under 10 seconds. The Link 16 integration means every Apache in a formation shares targeting data in real time, not just with each other but with forward air controllers, surveillance drones, and even fighter aircraft providing top cover. This creates a networked kill chain where targets identified by one platform can be engaged by another within seconds. The E-model's engine upgrade gives it a service ceiling of 21,000 feet and a maximum speed of 187 miles per hour, but speed and altitude are not the point with Apaches. The point is endurance and precision. With external fuel tanks, an Apache can remain on station for more than 3 hours, orbiting a target area, waiting for specific threats to reveal themselves, then striking with surgical precision. That loitering capability is what fighter jets cannot provide. An F-15 or F-35 has to keep moving, has to transit in and out of the battle space. An Apache can sit and wait. Now here is the geographic reality that makes this deployment so consequential. Iran's coastline along the Persian Gulf stretches approximately 1,500 miles from the Iraqi border in the northwest to the Strait of Hormuz in the southeast. But the vast majority of Iran's critical military infrastructure sits within 200 miles of that coastline. Why? Because Iran is not geographically uniform. The coastal regions are where the population centers are, where the industrial capacity exists, where the transportation networks connect to ports and the outside world. Tehran itself sits about 100 miles from the Caspian coast in the north, but the military-industrial facilities that produce drones, missiles, and advanced weapons systems cluster around cities like Avaz, Bushehr, Bandar Abbas, and Isfahan. Isfahan is particularly significant. It sits roughly 220 miles from the coast, home to Iran's nuclear research facilities and some of its most important weapons production plants. 220 miles is well within the range of Apache operations when you factor in forward refueling points. An Apache launching from Kuwait or UAE bases can reach Isfahan with a single refuel at a forward location, hit targets, and return. That is not theoretical. That is basic mission planning. The deployment locations tell the real story. 72 Apaches represents approximately 4 full battalions. United States Central Command confirmed deployments to Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE. These are not random choices. Camp Arifjan sits less than 40 miles from the Iraqi border and about 100 miles from Iranian coastal installations in Khuzestan province. Al Udeid in Qatar positions helicopters directly across the Gulf from Bushehr and the Iranian naval facilities at Bandar-e-Mashar. Al Dhafra in the UAE is less than 100 miles from the Strait of Hormuz and Iranian positions along the southeastern coast. What this creates is overlapping coverage of Iran's entire Gulf coastline. There is no major Iranian military facility within 200 miles of the Gulf that is not now within practical Apache strike range. That includes drone production facilities, ballistic missile storage depots, Revolutionary Guard Corps naval bases, air defense command nodes, and the surface-to-air missile batteries that were supposed to protect all of those installations. Now let me show you exactly what this means in tactical terms. Iran's air defense network was designed to counter specific threats. High-altitude aircraft get engaged by long-range S-300 systems operating in the 500 to 600-kilometer range band. Medium-altitude threats face SA-15 and SA-20 systems with ranges between 30 and 200 kilometers. Low-altitude cruise missiles encounter point defense systems like the Pantsir S-1 and Iranian-produced variants. This is a layered defense model, and on paper it looks formidable. But every single one of these systems has a radar horizon problem. Radar is line of sight. If an object is below the horizon relative to your radar position, you cannot see it. At 100 feet above ground level, the radar horizon for a ground-based system is approximately 12 miles, depending on the height of the radar antenna itself. An Apache exploiting terrain masking, using valleys and ridgelines for cover, can approach within that 12-mile radius before any radar-guided system even knows it is there. 12 miles is well within Hellfire range. By the time an Iranian air defense battery realizes an Apache is targeting it, the missiles are already inbound. This is not speculation. We saw exactly this dynamic play out in Iraq in 1991 and again in 2003. Apache battalions conducted deep strikes against Iraqi air defense networks that were, at the time, considered some of the most sophisticated in the region. The helicopters would approach at extremely low altitude, pop up just long enough to acquire and engage targets, then drop back down and reposition. Iraqi forces equipped with Soviet-era SAMs and anti-aircraft artillery were repeatedly caught unable to engage effectively because their systems simply could not track targets moving that low and that fast through complex terrain. Iran knows this history. Iranian military planners have studied those campaigns exhaustively. But knowing about a vulnerability and being able to fix it are two different things. The physics of radar detection do not change. If you want to detect low-flying helicopters, you need airborne early warning, you need fighters on constant combat air patrol, or you need to position air defense systems on elevated terrain with clear sight lines. Iran has limited airborne early warning capability, its fighter force is aging and technologically outmatched, and many of its critical facilities sit in valleys or coastal plains where elevated radar coverage is geographically impossible. The strategic implications go far deeper than tactical overmatch. For years, Iran has maintained a defensive doctrine built around the concept of strategic depth and retaliation capability. The idea was simple. Even if the United States strikes Iranian facilities, Iran can respond by closing the Strait of Hormuz, launching ballistic missiles at regional allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, activating proxy forces across the region, and bleeding American forces through asymmetric warfare. That doctrine assumed American strikes would be limited, high-altitude, and vulnerable to the defensive network Iran had built. Apache deployments undermine every element of that calculation. Closing the Strait of Hormuz requires functional coastal anti-ship missile batteries, naval assets, and command and control infrastructure. Every single one of those elements is now a potential Apache target. Iranian ballistic missile facilities, many of which sit in the mountainous regions northeast of the Gulf, are harder to reach, but the launchers and support infrastructure closer to the coast are absolutely vulnerable. And critically, the underground bunkers that were supposed to protect drone production facilities and missile assembly plants were designed to resist penetration from above, from bombs dropped by high-altitude aircraft. They were not designed to resist precision strikes coming in at shallow angles from helicopters exploiting terrain. Here is where the second-order effects start to cascade. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states have spent the past 2 years normalizing relations with Iran to some degree, driven partly by concerns that American security guarantees might not be as reliable as they once were. That normalization was built on the premise that Iran represented a permanent fixture in the region, a power that had to be accommodated because it could not be easily defeated or contained. This Apache deployment sends a very different message. It demonstrates that the United States still possesses the capability to hold Iranian military power at risk in ways that Iran cannot effectively counter. That shifts the calculation for regional actors. If American military presence means Iran's offensive capabilities can be neutralized quickly, the incentive to accommodate Tehran decreases substantially. Think about what that means for the Abraham Accords and broader Middle East security architecture. Israel has been watching Iranian weapons production capabilities grow for years, particularly drone and precision-guided missile production that threaten Israeli air defenses. The ability of American forces to strike those facilities quickly and with reduced risk changes Israel's strategic calculations about whether it needs to conduct unilateral strikes. If Apache battalions can degrade Iranian drone production more effectively than Israeli F-35s penetrating hostile airspace, that creates new options for coordinated action that did not exist before. The economic dimension deserves attention as well. Iran's economy is heavily dependent on oil exports, and the vast majority of that oil moves through Gulf ports or through pipelines that terminate at coastal facilities. Those facilities, the loading terminals, the refining infrastructure, the pipeline networks, all of it sits within the operating radius we just discussed. The deployment creates an implicit threat to Iranian economic lifelines that goes beyond military targeting. This is economic coercion backed by demonstrable military capability. But let me pump the brakes here because there are real limitations and complications that need to be acknowledged. Apache helicopters are not invulnerable wonder weapons. They are complex machines operating in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Each deployment requires extensive logistical support, including maintenance crews, spare parts, fuel supplies, and ammunition stocks. Forward operating bases in the Gulf are themselves vulnerable to Iranian ballistic missile strikes. The July 2024 Iranian missile attack on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, which damaged or destroyed multiple aircraft on the ground, demonstrated that Iran retains the capability to strike American facilities with precision-guided weapons. Furthermore, Apaches require air superiority, or at minimum air parity, to operate effectively. They cannot survive against a competent fighter force. Iranian F-14 Tomcats may be old, but they still carry long-range air-to-air missiles that would be devastating against helicopters if they could establish contact. Any Apache operation into Iranian territory would require suppression of enemy air defenses, fighter escorts, and electronic warfare support. This is not a standalone capability. It is part of a much larger operational architecture. The 72 helicopters represent significant force, but spread across multiple bases and accounting for maintenance rotations. The actual number of aircraft available for simultaneous operations at any given moment might be as low as 40 to 50. That is enough to conduct significant strikes, but it is not enough to sustain prolonged operations without reinforcement. If this deployment is preparation for actual conflict rather than deterrence posturing, additional Apache battalions would need to flow into theater, along with the entire support apparatus required to sustain high-tempo operations. There is also the question of what this deployment signals about the broader state of U.S. and Iran relations and American strategy in the region. If this is a deterrent move, meant to prevent Iranian escalation or to protect against specific threats, then it might successfully freeze the current situation without shots being fired. But if this is pre-positioning for actual strikes, then we are potentially looking at the opening moves of a conflict that could reshape the entire Middle East. The difference between those two scenarios is enormous, and nothing about the deployment itself tells us which scenario we are actually in. Iranian leadership is not passive in this equation. They are watching this deployment just like we are, and they are making their own calculations. Do they interpret this as final warning to back down on nuclear development, on proxy force operations, on weapons transfers to Russia? Or do they see it as evidence that conflict is inevitable and therefore choose to strike first or accelerate their own preparations? That decision matrix in Tehran is unknowable from the outside, but it is absolutely critical to what happens next. Alternative perspectives deserve consideration here. From Tehran's viewpoint, this deployment might look like vindication of their long-standing argument that the United States remains fundamentally hostile and that accommodation or negotiation is futile. Iranian hardliners who have opposed any form of engagement with Washington can point to 72 attack helicopters on their border as evidence that only strength and deterrence matter. This potentially undermines any remaining Iranian factions that might favor diplomatic resolution and empowers those advocating for acceleration of weapons programs, including nuclear development. Regional actors have mixed reactions as well. Gulf states hosting these helicopters publicly support American presence and appreciate the security umbrella it provides. But they are also acutely aware that they sit between two potentially hostile forces. If conflict breaks out, their territory becomes battlefield and their populations become targets for Iranian retaliation. The last thing Saudi Arabia or the UAE wants is to be drawn into a shooting war that devastates their economies and infrastructure. They want deterrence to work, they want Iran contained, but they do not necessarily want the kind of conflict that Apache deployments might presage. Russia and China are watching with intense interest. Both nations have invested in relationships with Iran, partly as a counterweight to American influence in the region. A successful American operation that degrades Iranian military capability would represent a strategic setback for both Moscow and Beijing. Expect both nations to provide Tehran with enhanced intelligence about American force movements, potentially share advanced electronic warfare techniques, and possibly accelerate weapons deliveries designed to complicate American operational planning. This is not just a U.S.-Iran story. This is a proxy battleground for great power competition. So what has fundamentally changed? The United States has moved from theoretical capability to demonstrated presence. American forces now sit in positions where they can strike Iran's most critical military infrastructure with weapons systems specifically designed for exactly those targets. That is not deterrence in the abstract. That is a loaded gun pointed at Tehran's head with a finger on the trigger. Whether that gun gets fired depends on decisions being made in Washington and Tehran right now, decisions we can only observe through their effects. The broader implication is that American military strategy in the Middle East is shifting from standoff strikes and limited engagement to forward presence and the capability for sustained operations. Apache deployments require commitment. You do not move 72 attack helicopters and all their support infrastructure across the world for a photo opportunity. This represents a decision that American interests in the region, whether that is preventing Iranian nuclear development, protecting oil shipments, or maintaining the security architecture that keeps Gulf states aligned with Washington, those interests justify the risk and expense of a major forward deployment. What remains uncertain is whether this deployment achieves its presumed objectives. If the goal is deterrence, does it actually deter Tehran, or does it provoke exactly the kind of escalation it is meant to prevent? If the goal is preparation for strikes, do those strikes actually succeed in degrading Iranian capabilities sufficiently to justify the risk of broader conflict? We do not have answers yet, but we are watching the setup in real time. Looking forward, there are several developments to watch closely. First, does Iran adjust its force posture in response? Do we see movement of critical assets away from coastal areas, deeper into the country's interior where Apache range becomes more problematic? Do Iranian forces increase alert levels at air defense sites? Do they surge ballistic missile units that could threaten American bases? Second, do additional American assets flow into theater? More fighter squadrons, additional refueling aircraft, enhanced electronic warfare capabilities, all of which would signal that this is operational preparation rather than just deterrent posture? Third, what happens diplomatically? Are there back-channel negotiations attempting to de-escalate, or does rhetoric from both capitals become more confrontational? Fourth, watch Israeli actions carefully. If Israel interprets this deployment as creating a window of opportunity for strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, with American forces positioned to handle the conventional military response, then we could see unilateral Israeli action that triggers exactly the broader conflict this deployment might have been meant to prevent. The intersection of American capabilities, Israeli threat perception, and Iranian calculations creates a volatile mix where miscalculation becomes genuinely dangerous. The next few weeks will tell us whether we are watching deterrence in action or the prelude to the most significant American military operation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The helicopters are in place. The capability is demonstrated. What happens next depends on decisions being made in capitals across the region and in Washington. Decisions where the margin for error is razor thin, and the consequences of miscalculation are measured in destroyed infrastructure, casualties, and potentially a regional war that reshapes the Middle East for a generation. If this analysis helped you understand why 72 helicopters represent something far more significant than routine deployment, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering every development in this situation as it unfolds, tracking force movements, monitoring diplomatic signals, and analyzing what it all means for regional stability. This story is not over. In many ways, it is just beginning.